Happy Wednesday and welcome to Climate Change slash Public Health. Very excited to get to talk with Crystal and Alicia today. But before we get into anything, just wanted to give us a little grounding of the conversation. If you have not as yet, definitely follow me on Instagram at the PH Millennial. I'll be putting out posts, sharing a little bit of information on all the topics related to National Public Health Week. So climate change is the most pressing threat. Climate change is the most pressing threat to health that our world faces today. We need swift action and intentional action to lessen the impacts of climate change and protect the most vulnerable communities. Climate change looks like increased frequent extreme weather events, disruption of food systems, increase in zoonosis, food, water, and vector-borne diseases, increase in mental health issues. Many communities of color and low-income communities the most impacted. This is because they have been the most disinvested, have higher exposure and greater vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Health outcomes that can be altered by climate change, which leads to increases in heat-related illnesses, respiratory illnesses, malnutrition, non-communicable diseases, mental and psychosocial health. 3.6 billion people live in areas of high susceptibility to climate change. Between 2030 and 2060, climate change is expected to cause 250,000 additional deaths per year. Today, we're going to talk a lot about climate change, and I'm very, very excited, as I said, to have Crystal and Alicia with me today. So I would love for you all to introduce yourselves as well as tell us how you're showing up today. And everyone that's watching this, be sure to hit that like button and to share it so that you can stay up to date with this informative climate change conversation.
Classic virtual call, like freeze, like who's going next? So I'm unmuted, so I can start us off. Hi everyone, my name is Alicia Richens. Yes, Omari is my brother, and I am a sustainable impact strategist. So I help different organizations, from nonprofits and social enterprises to community organizations, with their sustainability planning, particularly in alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that looks like everything from strategic development and planning to impact measurement systems. And currently also in the early stages of a climate storytelling project called the Climateverse. That's all about telling the news from parallel dimensions, where humanity is taking more transformative action on climate and social justice issues. So yeah, just really trying to bridge that work in community and organizations, but also getting into the fictional, imaginary futures world as well, in terms of just helping to imagine all the good possibilities of climate as well.
It was nice to meet you, Alicia. I did not even make the connection between you all. This is awesome. With family. I love this. All right. So I am Crystal Dixon. I'm an associate professor of the practice in the Department of Health and Exercise Science at Wake Forest University. I also have an appointment in the African American Studies program at Wake. I'm also the founder of Mango Consulting. So everything Alicia said just was music to my ears, because those are similar to what we're doing here at Mango. We just work with companies to help them adopt eco-friendly practices to minimize environmental harm impacting humanity. But we also bring public health and sustainability and environmental justice all together so that companies can understand the humanitarian aspect of their commitments in terms of carbon emissions. And so, I'm here today showing up just to learn. I'm here as a professor, of course, but also as a learner, always learning to understand what all my colleagues are doing in the world. And so I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Omar, for the invitation.
Truly is my pleasure. Just making sure I posted on my story that we are live so other people can join us as well. And as you're coming in, be sure to hit that like button and, share it with a friend. I think there's going to be a very informative conversation and we're going to learn a lot today. So jumping into things, how do unsustainable practices from companies contribute to the climate crisis and health disparities?
You can start this time, Crystal.
Oh, okay, that's fair. A few things. I want to first mention, Omari, because that's a really great question. That it's important to share that Black and Hispanics in the country are exposed to about 63% more higher levels of pollution on average than whites. And so a lot of times that's because of where they're located. And in some cases could be just location in terms of proximity to companies that are releasing toxins into the environment. So for example, we've heard of Cancer Alley in Mississippi. That's a place where it's a whole line of companies that are actually just dumping toxins in the backyards of people's homes. And so when you're living in those proximity of those areas, because it's affordable, it's convenient, you've always lived there, it leads to a lot of health disparities, particularly impacting Black and Brown communities. So we know that, right? So examples might be asthma. It could be respiratory allergies. It could be, it could be a plethora of things. Even endocrine disrupting toxins can create diabetes. I mean, these are things that are happening because you're just proximate to these locations. And so, in terms of health, it could be a host of things depending on who you are, your genetics, and the proximity you are, and the length of time you are exposed to these toxins and specific toxins. And so I'll stop there and let Alicia jump in, and I can certainly come in the end. But that's pretty a few things. We can get into forced migrations and all those other things that come with the environment of the warming planet. But that's one example in terms of what that means for environmental or health disparities, rather.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. I didn't mention it, but I'm calling in from Toronto, and in Canada, the story is very similarly. You had, I think you said Toxic Alley. Is that what
Yeah,
it's called?
Cancer Alley. Yep.
Cancer Alley. And in Canada, not too far away from Toronto, we have Chemical Valley. So it actually rhymes. And it's in Sarnia, just south of Toronto, and it's very near, in particular, to the Aamjiwnaang First Nation. So we see that in particular with Black and Indigenous communities in Canada being, located, like you said, very close to these industries that are heavy pollutants, that don't really consult community with what they're doing, don't let community into the decision making about how these things operate. And just to go back to your question, Omari, about what are companies doing? They're doing that. They're literally polluting the environment and polluting our communities, and they're doing it abroad on behalf of the US and Canada as well. Canada has many mining companies across Latin America, and some in Asia as well, that cause a lot of degradation to the Amazon, which is, the planet's lungs, essentially, is how we like to refer to it. And so, yeah, there's just so many impacts, from fossil fuels to mining to plastic to overconsumption, and they just, the media ad reel that keeps driving human consumption to our own detriment. And so, yeah, it's just really capitalism is how I would sum it up, what they're doing. And it's really hurting all of us, and especially those of us most marginalized by these systems.
Alicia, I don't know if we call it sacrifice zones here, because is that what they call it in Canada? Okay, yeah, it's really unfortunate. And for us, that particular example, and it's interesting to hear that in Canada, it's an 85-mile stretch of just petrochemical plants. And so it sounds like you have something exactly similar, like you said. Yep. Oh my goodness, that's unbelievable.
Yep.
I'm seeing in chat here that Osei says also Cancer Alley in Louisiana. So it is, as we've seen, these are things that have been structurally created, and they have left historical disparities. And we just know how important our climate is. And I think something that Alicia said, and something that I heard yesterday in the conversation around healthy neighborhoods, is just like, people have no say, they have no part in the conversation that goes into planning around these things. And I wanted to throw it back to Crystal, because I know you wanted to close out and talk more about that. And I know you have a lot of expertise in this. So what are some of the ways that we can work to close these kinds of disparities?
You said how we can close them, like close the gap?
Yes.
First, I want to acknowledge the comment in the chat. They're right. I meant Mississippi River. So you're absolutely, it is Louisiana. My brain was crossing there. So thank you for that correction. Yeah, I think really we have to have more, I hate to say this, but regulation is really what it's going to require, because what's happening is these permits are coming in, people aren't really protesting them, or they're happening in communities that are, quote, not empowered to really push back against the powers that be. So it's really going to require some regulation, which really depends on, unfortunately, who's in office in most cases. But I also think at the local level, you can, even if you're not as part of the federal level, locally, you can talk with your, I hate to sound cliche, but talking with your leaders, who are you voting for? How do you get ahead of that? If the people are coming that are going to build something, how do you express your opinion against it if you have the time? Because a lot of these folks that are affected by it, our communities are at work. They don't have time always to go and voice their opinions on the matter. Sometimes things happen, you don't know it. So I think that's one of the most important things, is really pushing against and having some accountability for these corporate companies. And also, in the work that me and Lisa are doing, if they're not going to do anything, at least be more sustainable, at least try to go green, at least try to just cut back on the carbon emissions you're actually producing, because that's really what's contributing to the health disparities crisis in the first place. It is capitalism. You can do that, and this is why you come to particularly our country to do what you want to do in some respect. But I think there's some humanity that has gone missing in the middle of those pursuits of happiness, right? In terms of, you know, finding your business and things of that nature. But I think at the end of the day, either accountability in terms of having some more enforcement on that, and or going more green and being more sustainable and exploring other sustainable options. That's just my initial response to that.
And we hear a lot, especially in the recycling world, or like the recycling conversation. I think this goes broader to like the climate change conversation, that it's an individual issue, or like people need to be responsible for the way that they're impacted. But as we started this conversation, we heard the impact that companies have on climate change, that companies have on the health. So can you share some knowledge or just talk more about that dynamic of corporate versus individual in the climate change conversation?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up a lot, and I have lots of feelings and thoughts about it, you know, because I think we each do have responsibility as individuals, as humans, as parts of humanity in, you know, pursuing a future that is sustainable and equitable and inclusive and just for all of us. But at the same time, we have some mega corporations who operate, who are the biggest cause or the biggest players, the biggest factors in the climate crisis that we have, who have had a really targeted campaign for decades to bury data that they knew, data that proved this climate change and proved the link between their business operations and climate change. They didn't just bury the data, they invented the concept of a carbon footprint to then get consumers to be so, you know, consumed with, you know, our own individual roles. So like, why, yes, we should, I mean, I also have thoughts about recycling, but we won't get into that. We should be practicing more sustainable habits. Composting is amazing, you know, buy secondhand, buy less, have these conversations in community. At the end of the day, like Crystal was saying, we need regulation, we need policy, we need to be able to hold these companies and communities accountable to the standards that we have decided to set in pursuit of a future that's more, you know, safe and healthy and equitable for all of us.
I appreciate that, Alicia. I wanted to add to that in terms of the irony of the medical field, right? You probably see a lot of this, Alicia and Amari as well, that hospitals, the healthcare sector, I think it's like 8.5% of healthcare waste is contributing to the climate crisis. We're talking about single-use plastics. People aren't, you know, during the pandemic, it was astronomical because we're doing one-time use of gowns, masks, everything to test people during that very dark time in our history here. And so people aren't really talking about that. And then there are people, particularly in the US, a company, for example, called Stericycle that actually cleans instruments to reuse, but also the byproduct of that process is creating more emissions. And so you're seeing the greenwashing a little bit of things, as well as in the wood pellet industry, just random stuff, right? So I think we have to be very careful with when we're trying to contribute to solving the crisis, not contributing to it again, which is what we're seeing a lot of in those two examples.
And
sorry, I'm all right. Practice Green Health is an example that's actually fighting against that here locally in North Carolina.
Yeah, that's so great to hear because, yeah, in the pandemic, I definitely noticed this challenge between like hygiene and sanitation and sustainability. And I don't think it needs to be either or. So I'm really glad that there are initiatives like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Crystal, you mentioned greenwashing, and the first question in chat comes from Winston asking, what are your thoughts on greenwashing? And before you answer that, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to put them in chat and I'll ask them as they come up.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think greenwashing is very misleading. I think it's almost like you're trying to convince the public you're doing something. For example, if a petroleum company is trying to be more sustainable, that's kind of greenwashing because your entire company is contributing to the crisis. And so I hesitate because it's almost like you're putting a Band-Aid on something you're not really fixing. And so it just, you know what I mean? At least you see this a lot. I don't, it's almost I guess my opinion is I don't agree with it. I guess that answers the question, but I appreciate the effort, but I know it's not efficient, it's not effective, right? So it's just odd. Like I said, the wood pellet industry is an example of that, where you have biomass burning facilities that emit like 2.8 times the amount of pollution of power plants than those that burn coal and natural gas. But we're using the wood pellet industry to recycle, you know what I mean? So you have to be very careful with that. So I think it can be very misleading.
Yeah, it can definitely be misleading. And to your point, I definitely have empathy for the companies that are trying.
Yeah.
But I think the challenge comes up when we don't have enough policy and regulation in place to actually like guide them. And so
Mhm.
they're used to operating in a certain way, and now they're trying to operate slightly differently. They want to respond to consumer demands. And so we get this greenwashing effect happening. And I think, while we need to kind of hold them accountable for that and to not mislead the public, on the other end, we need to make sure that we have certain policies and regulations in place that they can, really easily follow, or at least, follow if they chose
Yeah.
to avoid that in the first place.
I like that comment, Alicia, following up with it, because I think that's the problem. There's no accountability to the labels they're putting on their products. Like, how do we know you're actually doing what you say you're doing? Right. And so I appreciate you saying that, because that's a huge gap.
And we've spoken a little bit about it, but more explicitly, what are the most urgent public health challenges posed by climate change? And how can interdisciplinary collaboration between public health, environmental science, and the policy sectors address these challenges effectively?
I mean, I feel like every climate challenge is a health challenge, right? Whether you're worried about flooding in your home and whatever pests come in because of that, or fire and the smoke inhalation to your body system. We see the rise of diseases spreading, non-communicable diseases that are, typically quite easy to manage, become a lot harder. We see entire ecosystems falling apart, and so people lose their homes and their livelihoods and their connection to land. I just think the list goes on and on. I don't know if there are any other particulars you wanted to highlight, Crystal.
Yeah, Lisa, I agree with those. I think heat-related illnesses are becoming more prevalent, particularly in public health, because it's warming, obviously. And then there are people that are the elderly being more affected by these heat waves that are, particularly if you don't have any, air conditioning, that could be a really problematic. I think examples of working together in terms of interdisciplinary, Mari, would be like joining the Paris Agreement, not to not leave it, right? And so I think joining back on a global scale to work towards a world commitment, it's going to take that kind of interdisciplinary work, but also at the local level. How can you work? How can you empower? How can you use your own influence to empower decisions that are being made, bills that are being passed, laws that are being decided on? Those are what's going to matter. And I think it's important to understand the power that you have in those places. If you have a seat at the table and someone's supposed to be there, bring someone there that's not there. I think it's important that you have to have the community voices at the table if you're going to really address this issue. Unfortunately, it's not happening enough. So displacement, that's becoming a problem. Sea level rise, that's not a major issue, but it's becoming one in terms of forced migration, mental health illnesses. Those are becoming, as you know, I think this is the first year our Surgeon General has declared mental health a public health crisis, not this year, maybe 2-3 years ago. That's a thing, at least in here in the US, Alicia. But yes, I agree with everything. And like you said, it's just so endless. It's almost staggering. It's constantly, piling up on one another. And I think it's going to also air pollution, although we don't realize it, indoor air pollution is the leading cause of death globally, not for our country, but for the world. And so that's a problem that people aren't thinking about. We're used to having clean energy here, gas stoves and all that electricity, but other places around the country don't have that. So those are things you have to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that you brought up the collaboration and the Paris Climate Agreement. We definitely hope to see y'all join us back there again. I also wanted to shout out the UN Sustainable Development Goals framework, because I think it's a really powerful framework to pull together all of these different interdisciplinary spaces, whether you're working more directly on climate mitigation and adaptation, whether you're working more directly in terms of health or food security or education. It just gives us a framework to really start to work better together. I hope that in the next the next, what do we have, like 6 years left until 2030, which was our deadline to reach the SDG goals, just like the Paris Agreement.
Right.
I hope that we start to deepen those collaborations and think more deeply when we think about what's to come after these agreements, of putting together global agreements that really think about local implementation better and think about, actions that are multi-solving, right? Where you have one action that can tackle multiple different challenges, and really diving deeper into those possibilities.
Lisa, I like what you said, because I think one of the things I want to see more, and Omari, to your question as well, is more grassroots organizations being funded. I have never seen so much funding coming out of the woodworks right now on environmental justice. And I really, 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 really want to see it funneling down to those very organizations that are on the floor, on the ground, literally fighting for their lives in their communities every day. Not that it's not happening, but I want to see it happening more. And that's when you start seeing the disparities close, I think, because the right people are being empowered with the finances need to make the difference. Not that the companies who are funded are not doing things, but I think the higher you get, the more commercialized it gets. So, you want to get down to the actual communities, and I think that's the way to go.
Yes, more money, more unrestricted funding, instead of just funding one-time little projects, really funding the operations and finding more creative ways to fund, initiatives that aren't just these official charities and nonprofits. I don't know about the legal structures in the US, but in Canada, a lot of that money is held back unless you have charitable status, which is a whole other palaver to jump into.
That's an interesting systemic barrier. I'm sure there's something along those lines here. It depends on who the RFP or request for proposals come from. Like you said, the restrictions make a difference. Unrestricted, I like what you said, that unrestricted funding, also not having these gatekeepers at the door to say what you can and can't do, and who do you have to partner with to get this money. It's just a lot. I was on this Robert Wood Johnson anti-racism consortium. It was a fund. It was a consortium designed to specifically take out systemic racism from the funding process. And so that's because a lot of these individuals are trying to become better at that, but they're not sure where the systemic inequities are. So I think that model should be applied to all funding. You should not create a barrier to getting access to funding.
Absolutely. And I'm hearing a lot of the people that are most impacted by the issues need to be at the tables, need to have capacity to be at the tables, to also play a part in the policy conversations, and also play a part in holding accountable, the accountability part, in holding corporations, governments accountable to what they say that they're going to do. So I want to go global before I come very local. We spoke a little bit about forced migration and sea level rising, and I think we think about climate change oftentimes just centrally North America, but we know that the impacts are going to be seen probably a lot harsher in lower income countries. Can you share more about your perspectives? And I know, Crystal, you've done work globally. Obviously, you have a global perspective, and I've also traveled to do a lot of talking around these types of things. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Omari. I think it's unfortunate, again, that those who are are contributing the least to this climate crisis are the ones affected the most. And I see the irony of what I see is specific people who are opposed to immigrants coming to our country and are also opposed to the climate crisis being real. They're going to see the climate crisis create an influx of immigrants coming in response to inaction. So I think it's really interesting that that's becoming a bit of an irony in that. I think it's unfortunate that we're not moving fast enough. There are going to be a lot of folks literally losing their entire countries potentially. Even here in the US, there are some, we live in North Carolina, Omari. The Outer Banks are literally going underwater, right? Every day, every year, it's something happening on the coast. And I grew up here in Cary, North Carolina, so I'm very familiar with that area. But I think it's going to become more prevalent. We're going to see a lot of people migrating to the direction is just to live and survive. And we're going to be forced to figure out, how do we coexist with people that we ordinarily wouldn't? It's going to force a lens of racial equity. It's going to create some tension. It's going to create a nuanced way of thinking of how we coexist with people across the world. And so that's my thinking with that, which isn't a bad thing, but people who are not for climate change. It's a bit ironic that that will be coming in response to inaction.
1000%, I agree with you. You know, I think there's so much in terms of our cultural consciousness, like you said, in terms of racial equity, the work that we have to do to even prepare for what's to come. And I think there's also so much work that we have to do to mitigate those challenges. Like you mentioned, Pacific Islands in particular are already starting to sink. Kiribati is negotiating with Australia to get some land so that they can continue to exist as a cohesive unit somewhere and not just kind of dissipate into history. And you know, these are just like very real existential threats to entire cultures and communities and ethnicities. And we need to start to show up more. I think we need to start coughing up a lot more money from those of us in the global north who have been literally pillaging the rest of the world to build our wealth. I'm really glad that we had the start of the Loss and Damage Fund. I'm really championed out to the Caribbean, love to see it. But we need more money, and we need that money getting channeled a lot faster. Similarly to what we were saying about the local level, just send the money. Stop all this bureaucracy and all these debt situations that just keep holding countries back. And fund and, you know, share training, share capacity, share technology, share resources. To really try to mitigate this. And on the other end, you know, there are some impacts that we cannot evade. And so we need to start preparing, like Crystal was saying, for that influx of climate migration and climate refugees coming into our countries.
Yeah, I love that, Alicia. You're so right. And Omari, I want to respond to your part of your question about doing work abroad. Some colleagues of mine are in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. My family's from
Is it okay? It's just Crystal frozen. Okay.
Yes, it seems that Crystal is frozen. Hopefully we'll get her back in a second.
Yeah, I want to hear more about her work in St. Vincent and her connections to Jamaica. You know, it was really great. I went to COP28 last year and I got to meet Mia Motley, which is like huge highlight. And I just love her work in championing the need for climate finance and the whole concept of climate debt. I actually wrote a paper on this that was published in a Routledge journal when I was in grad school, of just the whole concept of the fact that a lot of our Western countries in the North have all of this wealth as a direct result of the pillaging from, you know, the transatlantic slave trade to just mining operations that continue to this day, that have propelled and really profit up the development that we and the convenience and the comforts that we enjoy now. But we've left so many people behind, and we actually owe them money. You know, France charged how many hundreds of millions of francs to Haiti when they actually won their independence. And yet now, you know, look at countries like Haiti really struggling to manage when it comes to democracy, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to climate resilience. We need to be paid for the work and the contributions that we have made to human development in general. And so that's why it's called a climate debt. So it's not really aid. You're not really helping the global south. You're actually paying a fair wage back for everything that they've done for us. And now Crystal is back, and I want to hear all about this project in St. Vincent.
I'm so sorry. I missed what you just said, and I don't know what just happened, but I am back. Sorry about that. Yes, Alicia, I would love to hear what you just said too. Yes, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So a friend of mine, she's from there. We went over there to do some research to pretty much work with local leaders to address the climate crisis. There are people on the ground, they're doing phenomenal work already. And so we joined them and to help work with them to figure out pretty much how to prepare leaders with the climate crisis with the warming planet. They just had La Souffleur, a volcano erupt there. They had dengue fever, pandemic, COVID-19, of course, all that was happening at the same time. And so we went there to work with them to kind of equip them and how they can become more prepared when other disasters happen. They seem to have a really, really good plan in place when we went there to talk to all their people in the ministries of health there. But another thing we're doing next in terms of the climate crisis is that, interestingly enough, Union Island, they don't have water infrastructure, which is one of the 32 islands. They don't have no water infrastructure. They catch their water into recycled oil bins. And what's happening is there's, as you may understand this, Lisa, with your background in toxicology or your connection with that, there is a leaching happening from those bends into the people that are drinking the water. And it's leading to a public health crisis of they're having liver issues. So we're going to go back this summer with my coworker here in the engineering department at Wake Forest, and we're going to actually go and sample the water and figure out a way to get funding to the local community partners there to help them replace those bins so they can have water, as the climate's going to only get hotter, and so they're only going to get worse. So those are examples of what we're hoping to fund local communities doing great work already. Their name was the Attackers, but they've changed it, and I can't remember what the new name is, but they're doing fantastic work.
I love that. I was just talking about the concept of climate debt, really considering the contributions that, the global South has made to the development of the global North. And so, this money we're talking about transferring isn't just like some benevolent aid transfer. It's actually like fair pay for everything that the global South has contributed, for everything that the global South has to face now, thanks to our operations in the North. So it's really great to hear about projects like that. One of my clients is the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, and their background is way more in terms of health, thinking about marginalized communities like queer communities, sex workers, HIV. And so I'm helping them to really expand their kind of focus into climate justice and how to support all of those different community organizations to advocate for themselves and start thinking about what they need in terms of climate justice. So it's great to see those like community-based, but also technical projects happening on the ground.
I love that, Alicia. It's so refreshing to hear it's intentionally happening and getting into the hands it should get into. I wanted to circle back and answer something you asked earlier, Maria, about interdisciplinary collaboration in response to Alicia's comments. One example is this: in North Carolina, we got funding from NASA, who funded UNCW. I was brought on as a consultant, as well as the local leaders there who were working in sustainability infrastructure. And we actually interviewed the community to say, what do you want in your community as it relates to becoming more suitable in terms of infrastructure? Because there was a lot of flooding going on. So how do we prevent the flooding? A lot of times more affluent communities, as you know, are getting all these great green infrastructural solutions, but it's leaving out minority communities. And actually, Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, talks about this often. He actually just recently posted something about this, but the importance of getting their voices to say, hey, I want a piece of that money. I want my community to look green. I want to feel like I have rain gardens. I want permeable concrete. Can we figure this out? And so we did a huge project out there working to get what they want done into the hands of policymakers who make the decisions to determine how the money's spent. And so that's a great way to work together. We brought academics in, we brought in researchers, we brought in students as well, who created an environmental justice vulnerability index to show where flooding's happening, what's suitable to put. I mean, it was a lot of work going into it, but I love the combination of funding that was put into the hands of the right people who brought the right people up to the table, and also work with the local mayor. So a lot of this is happening here in Eastern North Carolina to actually prevent flooding from rising sea levels.
I love that so much. We have this stereotype that Black people don't care about climate.
Right.
And it's so not true. Like nobody's asking, nobody's asking what's happening and what they need. I'm so glad that exists. I'm part of a project in the Toronto region that's called Climate Change Preparedness in Black Communities. And I feel like it's the very early stages of like what you're describing. And so I will definitely be calling you.
Let's connect. Yes.
It's just we're really at that early stage of that conscious raising of like, I get into these rooms and people come in and they're like, yeah, I don't know anything about climate change. I'm just here to learn. And then I turn it back on them and be like, what have you witnessed in your community? And it's like, actually, you know everything about climate change.
That's right.
To your life, right?
I love that.
To build that consciousness and community, and then hopefully we'll be able to get that kind of programming running like yours. So yeah, we'll definitely stay in touch.
Yeah, for sure. And I will come to Canada if I need to. And I will say this. The reason why we don't care is because in the past, climate change has only been talking about planet Earth. And I always talk about who has time to think about planet Earth when you have to pay your bills, you have people to see, you got to pick up your kids. You're not thinking about it. But when you start to make humanity the center of the crisis, now I'm bought in. I understand why I need to understand this now, right? I think the way it has been pitched historically has just been, you have the privilege of thinking about being more, greener and more, you know what I mean? Like you just have the time to think about, you don't have the time if you're literally trying to get paycheck to paycheck, you're trying to figure out where your next meal is coming from. And you're not going to think about how much carbon emissions am I giving out. You're just not going to do that. Right. And also historically getting access to these green cars have been expensive. So how do I contribute when I can't afford what it means to be sustainable? Right. So I'm excited. We definitely could have to connect, Lisa. I would love to learn more about what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Like my own journey into the environmental space took so long because I remember just feeling like these white people care more about dogs than they do about Black people getting killed. Like I don't understand.
That
Right.
is the
And
reality.
historically, the environmental space has been dominated by, white people, particularly like you're saying, because they're the ones who are resourced, who have enough money to not worry about,
That's
their
right.
day-to-day expenses. So now we can start up a nonprofit or a foundation or a trust,
That's right.
and go
Yeah,
care about these things and, make our granola and leave everybody else behind.
that's
And we
exactly
need to start to broaden that conversation and like you said, talk about the humanity of this. It's not about us saving the planet. The planet's
that's
going to be
right.
just fine. It's
Right.
about maintaining the conditions that we as humans and all of the other species that we rely on need to
Right.
survive.
Exactly. And I will say, I think the sustainability aspect, I understand their resources are running out, but to your point, Alicia, that's not what's getting me up in the mornings. I'm looking to save communities where I'm a part of. Like I'm not going to save them, but I want to help my community live the life expectancy they earned. Right? We're right now we're losing our rights to life every day. I used to drive home. I often say your zip code is a bigger predictor of your health outcome than your genetic code. You probably heard that being in public health. When I used to drive home in another zip code I lived in, I can visibly smell the air just change. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just not going to live longer being in this zip code. I had to move. I had the privilege of moving. A lot of folks don't. Omari, when the Beaver Plant fire happened, you were here, and I didn't even realize you're in Winston-Salem. Now I know when it happened, and I don't want to jump ahead of us, but I often say what happened at.
Oh, no.
Not again. Nope.
Oh,
You,
you're back. You're back.
yes.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what's going on today. Am I here?
Yes.
Okay, I'll say this and I'll stop talking. Essentially, we evacuated, didn't think twice about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I say, why don't we use the same approach to communities that could not evacuate to get them out as well? That's systemic racism. That's environmental racism. When you don't think of other humans the same as others who have different socioeconomic status, right? So I'll stop there because I don't know what's going on with my internet.
Yeah, no, I agree so much, and I think one of our challenges in communicating this crisis and this problem is that for some reason, the narrative comes out that, sustainability and sustainable living is a step back, oh, these environmentalists want us to go live in caves again, or like they want to take away our internet, or they want to take away this. And it's like, actually, no, we're talking about making life better because historically we've experienced all of these inequities in addition to, the things that we do that harm both the planet and our bodies. And we're thinking about ways to like operate in the world in a way that is sustainable, meaning that the planet can continue to sustain us, that is equitable, where we all have opportunities and access. And it's like, yeah, nobody's taking a step back. We're actually like taking a step forward to
That's
something
right.
that's better, even in the midst of everything that we're losing because of the climate crisis.
That's right. I couldn't have said it better.
I love this. I love this. I'm loving the conversation and the thoughts, the natural flow of things. And Crystal, you're right. So we spoke a lot about global. Now we're going very local. Yes, I live in Winston-Salem, as Crystal now knows. And I think it was 2 years ago, where I live in Winston-Salem, there was a fertilizer plant fire, the Winston Weaver fertilizer fire. And I would love for you to share more about this as an example of environmental injustices.
Yes, thank you, Omari. And you probably had some firsthand experiences as well. But essentially, there was a plant that caught on fire here in a specific community that was near low-income communities where most plants are placed here. And so what happened is essentially Wake Forest University had been exposed because of the wind direction to all the ammonium nitrate as a result of the fire, which was dangerous. While some students were able to leave, some decided to stay on campus, but most had the options of leaving. Some hopped on a jet to go to the Bahamas, just to give you some perspective of Wake Forest. No shade, do what you got to do. But others didn't have that privilege. Literally, those who were living in homes there had to endure that. And so as a result, we don't know. I'm actually involved in a study right now with Wake Forest faculty at the Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center, as well as Department of Engineering and others. We've done water sampling to see how did this affect the water quality in the area? Because a lot of communities were concerned about being exposed to this ammonium nitrate, getting into their water system, and no one's testing. So we've been doing testing there to figure that out. As of right now, there has not been any levels that have been concerning, but the problem is we don't have any baseline data before the plant. So there could have been an increase, but we don't know what that is. With that said, the concern is that this is a case study to talk about how, the response was. There's also been monies allocated to compensate the families who were affected because they had to relocate. And there's some controversy behind how those monies were distributed and if those families got the monies. And of course, a lot of times a local nonprofit would have the money and they're given some overhead money and then they're responsible to distribute. And there's some concern that it has not been distributed to the amount that it should. So there's another systemic challenge there. And I've talked about this in various news outlets if they asked us questions about it, and I'm happy to share those. But it's just unfortunate to see the response to the tale of two stories. One, get off campus, get out, no questions asked. The other, oh, bear with it, figure it out on your own. And that's the systemic environmental injustices we're fighting for to stop that response when it comes to low-income Black and Brown communities.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And one of the things I want to lift up, I think you already alluded to it, and I would link the articles after this is done to come back to YouTube, listen on Public Health Careers. You'll see the link to the articles. But like to your point, is like these families that have been historically disinvested, like low socioeconomic class, they don't have the resources to up and leave. And then when there is this program that is supposed to be a solution to help them, you hear that the program, they only offered like one time for families to come and try to get funding. And then after that, they had to set up an appointment with the company. And I drew a graph the other day of like opportunity versus like barriers, and I mean income versus barriers, and it just shows like the less income you have, the more barriers you have, and you just always have to fight so much more for the things that you deserve, even when things aren't your fault. And they are these historical systemic things like redlining that have caused these factories to be in places, as well as we have the hyper-capitalism side of things where the amount, I believe, of the ammonia nitrate was a lot higher than they were reporting or something along those lines. But it just goes to show, like, even in the community that I live in, this is probably happening all around the US, all around the world. And there's just so much that needs to be done to ensure that these communities are given the solutions, given the chance to really like have better health. And there's a lot to do there.
Yeah, Omari. And, you see this continuing on even when it comes to flooding, when we have a hurricane or some kind of storm. The process of getting help is always a lot of red tape, and it requires you to do the unimaginable just to get basic help. And then there's criteria that's set that weeds out people who can actually be eligible for said support. And then you think about your house not being insured because you can't afford flood insurance because it's astronomical. So there you are. And then all of a sudden your house is taken away by investors who are going to flip it and make a fortune. And you're sitting on the side of the road looking to live with your friend or your friend, So it's just, there's got to be something, that protects people when it comes to these crises that are only going to get more frequent. So I appreciate that question. It's close to home.
And there's a question in the chat. I don't know if either of you have the expertise to answer it, but I will ask and you will let me know. So Carice asked, and I hope I'm saying it in correctly, Carice, how is AI helping to provide intelligence about climate change problems, and are, are there models that we can trust?
Yeah, Omari. And, it, you see this continuing on even when it comes to flooding, when we have a hurricane or some kind of storm. The process of getting help is always a lot of red tape, and it requires you to do the unimaginable just to get basic help. And then you think about your house not being insured because you can't afford flood insurance because it's astronomical. So there you are. And then all of a sudden your house is taken away by investors who are going to flip it and make a fortune. And you're sitting on the side of the road looking to live with your friend or your friend, So it's just, there's got to be something,
Well, I mean, AI, artificial intelligence as it exists now is not yet generative. So AI is really just referencing information that already exists on the web. There is no like new information that AI can provide you. It can just, it's kind of like pulling Google into one space to do a task for you based on everything that Google already has. I don't know if you had more on that, Crystal.
Yeah, I love, you're right. I agree with that. It's very limited in that scope. I also say the most, and this is not my expertise at all, but I appreciate the question. I can kind of see it working well with predicting weather, possibly. I mean, that's already predictive models are out there, but perhaps getting more specific on that. I don't know if that's even answering that question. That's a question that I would love to explore further as we become more familiar with AI. I'm still trying to understand AI in terms of what it all can do.
Yeah.
Like I'm seeing robots being created. I'm seeing it's so much that it can do. It actually can also apparently duplicate people's voices now. I'm hearing that's becoming a thing. It's going to be released after the election for reasons that are obvious. You don't want to have that released before an election. But yeah, that's a good question. I think more about that.
Same. I think there's a real challenge with AI in terms of making sure that it's not regurgitating um, false information and
Yeah.
misinformation. But we don't need to be like so afraid of it. I think the more that we try to embrace it and engage with it will equip us to set up the right regulatory frameworks to make sure that nefarious things aren't happening behind our backs.
I agree with that.
Yeah, so much more to come, and I think it's an interesting conversation, and just trying to think about like how we can utilize tools like AI to really support communities and create like models that help us better prepare for emergencies and just different things that come up like that. Um, so I appreciate that. And we are coming down close to the end. So if you have any last minute questions, be sure to put them in chat. And my next question is, how can we advocate for policies and initiatives that prioritize climate justice and address the disproportionate impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities, both locally and globally?
I think this really highlights kind of, some of the power that we have as individuals and as communities, and the responsibility we have. People always talk about like, what's the biggest thing you can do for climate? And while there are lots of little technical things you can do when it comes to diet and transportation and housing and family planning, I think one of the most powerful things you can do is talk about it, have more conversations inside your home with your family, with your neighbors and your friends, and possibly more importantly, with your elected representatives. Who is your councillor? We have very different systems. In Canada, I would say, who's your member of provincial parliament or your member of parliament versus your congressman or senator? Really getting to know who the heck is representing you in government and making sure that they hear what you care about. And as you have more conversations with the people in your community, that voice gets louder and louder, and we start to see the changes that we want to see, right? Because it's all about the numbers and building up those numbers and building that human connection to get there too.
I love that, Alicia. I would echo that. I would also add that knowing your privilege in this space, and whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether association status, use your privilege to make this issue centered everywhere you go. And what I mean by privilege is just essentially how you show up in the world, opens specific doors and gets certain attention from certain people. So use that and learn what that is. If you have a platform, if you have a social media platform that have a large following, use that. Learn about what's going on. Go into the communities you're curious about and actually learn and listen to what's going on. Speak out. Also, you want to examine policies that you can weigh in on. Like I mentioned earlier, permitting processes. There's a comment period. There are opportunities here in the US where you can actually give feedback on specific permits. You can show up and have like public speaking. You can do public comments at your county commissioner meetings, your local city council meetings, also your school board meetings. These are places where I've spoken personally on issues related to issues of sustainability and other organizing issues related to equity and education. So those are where your voice can be heard. You can also write, you can email, you don't have to show up all the time. And lastly, I would say just always bring this conversation up in any place you're at to create a narrative that is true. A lot of people are trying to erase the reality of what's happening in these systems. And the reality is systems are creating these inequities. It's not the people, it's the systems. And I'll say one last thing. For example, in healthcare, we call it health disparity. We call it the difference health disparity. In education, we call it the achievement gap. In the judiciary system, we call it the disproportionate minority contact. And the banking system, the wealth gap. Every system has a gap that affects Black and brown people. So this is a systemic issue that should be addressed, and I would explore your privilege in that process.
And moving us on, what is climate anxiety?
Yeah, it's a new word. I don't know, Lisa, I didn't want to cut you off there.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it's also, people also say eco-anxiety. I've heard both ways, but it's pretty much distressing feelings related to the impacts of climate change. We're putting a lot of pressure on the younger generations. And it's really just, you're uncertain, there's lack of control, you're feeling, am I safe? It's all these feelings happening and you want to do something about it, but you don't know where to start because it's such a vast issue. And so I will say, according to the American Psychological Association, 2/3 of people in this country are feeling climate anxiety right now. They're literally saying, I'm feeling really stressed out about this. And so that's what it is, the uncertainty of what's happening.
Yeah, and around the world, I think the stat was almost 90% of youth around the world say that, their experience of climate anxiety, climate grief, climate despair, whatever, what word they use for it really affects their day-to-day life. I think for younger generations in particular, kind of feeling powerless, feeling like the people in charge aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. For decades now, we keep hearing that the children are the future and they're going to change the world. It's like, guys, like which one of us is actually going to make it happen? We can't just keep putting it down to younger generations. So yeah, I absolutely agree with everything Crystal said. And I think we've been so used as human beings, physiologically, we've been so used to a certain sense of stability in the world where, I do what my parents did and I live where my parents lived and I can have this job and it's going to carry me through my life. And increasingly over the past few decades, as, human society gets more complex, but also as climate change becomes more, bad, more impactful, we have this increasing sense of uncertainty. The future is very uncertain. Scientists can't even really definitively say what climate change is going to look like next week or next year. Every year they're saying that everything is looking worse than they anticipated. Some days it's better. And so I think, psychologically, it's very hard for us all to deal with that uncertainty. And while younger generations are a lot more vocal about their anxiety and despair, I think we all feel it, and it might just be a little bit more subconscious, you know, and it's about remembering that we only get through it together, that is going to help us, and not feeling like, oh no, the world is changing, screw everybody else, I just care about my community, which I think is another expression of climate anxiety that people just aren't conscious of. So I think, it's just all the feelings that we're feeling, all the discomforts we have around the uncertainty of life right now. And we really need to pay attention to that. As Crystal had mentioned earlier, it's becoming a health epidemic, a mental health challenge, and really start to pull each other closer instead of pushing each other apart in response to that challenge.
Lisa, I love what you said earlier about, I think you said something about doing your part. I think it's important that people find what they're comfortable doing and do it. And I know that your part, you mentioned working together. You're one of, like, if everyone comes together, like you said, you're one of thousands, millions that are actually making an actual change. So know that you're actually making a difference. That one less plastic bottle, maybe that one comment you made, find I think it's important to find what you're comfortable doing. Not everyone's going to be an activist, right? Not everyone's going to show up and go to rallies. If you would prefer writing, if you prefer to do blogs, or you prefer to be on a panel like we are today, do what's comfortable for you and you own it and you stick in that space and you really feel like I'm making a difference. And that's great. And celebrate yourself for the small wins, because you're part of a bigger goal here that requires us to work together, as Alicia said.
Amen. We all have our role to play, and we don't each have to have it all figured out. You know,
That's
just
right.
do your own little thing and know that there are tons of people around the world also trying.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I think this is a great place to stop. This has been a very enriching and enlightening conversation for myself. I learned a lot. People in the chat were loving it. They were sending fire emojis. They were laughing. They were loving. They were appreciative of calling out Haiti. So I really appreciate people in the chat interacting today, and all the great insights that you all shared with us around climate change and public health. And I'm very, very glad that we were able to chat today.
Me too. This is
My
great.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really great.
Awesome.
Thank you for the invitation, Amari. It's great to meet you, Alicia.
Good to meet you too.
Yeah, the pleasure is mine. And as you all know by now, there will be panels every day of National Public Health Week. Tomorrow is New Tools and Innovations in Public Health, 6 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. I will see you there. Peace, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.